Okay, so the first thing I would say is that whatever colour fabric you're using, I would try and use a thread that matches as closely as possible, and that's because when sewing them together, the middle bit of it can be slightly trickier, so it kind of helps if you've got a thread that will just kind of blend in. The needles I tend to use milliner's needles, and these are size 11, so they're quite long and they're quite skinny. The thread I'm using is Gutermann and it's polyester, and that's because I find that has so much more strength than when I sew with a cotton thread for paper piecing. So in the same way that I did when basting, I'm going to hold the thread, get this into focus, I'm going to hold the thread between my thumb and my forefinger, and then I'm going to pull it out to my elbow, and then I'm going to snip the thread. Now, the end of the thread that you snip is the end of the thread that you want to tie the knot in. So I'm going to loop it round 2 fingers, and I'm then going to pass that thread through the loop and pull it. Now this is much thinner than the thread I was using for basting, so I'm actually going to do three knots, one on top of each other now. So that was the first one. I'm going to do the second one and make sure it lands directly on top. You can see here, sorry about my fingers, that's why you should wear a thimble. You can see the state of mine when the needle goes into it. So I've done 2 knots. I'm just going to do a third one, and that's because I know that I pull my thread really, really tight, and if I don't do 3 knots, it ends up pulling through. So I've got 3 knots here, and I'm now ready to thread up. So I'm going to hold the thread between my thumb and my forefinger and bring this up into focus. So between my thumb and my forefinger, and I'm going to then take the needle down onto it, and I'm going to pull the tail down about 1/3 of the way through. So for sewing your kites together, you're going to sew them in sets of 3s, and again, this is just the way that I prefer to do it. If you find another way that works for you, then that's absolutely fine. So we're going to start by sewing from here, so we're going from the outside in. Now I sew left to right because it feels more natural, because it's the direction that I write in, but if you prefer to sew from right to left, then I would just say make sure you're still sewing from the outside edge in, so you can see that I turned it around then. So I'm going to start sewing here down to here. I'm just going to fold that tail out of the way, and then I'm actually going to use these slightly skinnier Wonder clips, and I quite like these for sewing the pieces together. I tend to use the bigger ones, or the normal size ones, for basting, the skinnier ones for sewing together, and then there's even bigger ones which you can use for doing binding. So I'm really going to get this into focus now. So I'm not going to start directly on this edge, just because I think this tends to be a weak point if it's right on the edge, and I don't want to risk my knot going all the way through. So I'm going to start about 1/4 of an inch in from the edge, and I'm going to go through, I've just gone through the very edge fibres of these, so I'm not going through the templates, I'm just going through, I'd say, like 2 bits of fibre on each piece of fabric, and I've pulled my needle all the way through, and you can see my 3 knot is stopping it from coming through. And then I'm going to take another stitch directly where that first stitch was and pull it, and now I'm going to go back to this point over here. So I'm just going to take another stitch right on this edge now. So we're then just going to continue stitching, and this is called a whip stitch. So I've taken 1 stitch through, I'm going to take a 2nd stitch just so it's really anchored into place, and then I'm taking a stitch about 1/16 of an inch each time, and I'm pulling it fairly tightly, and you can see that the stitches sort of start to melt in with the fabric. Sorry about the cat hair there. So I'm just going through the very edges of the fibres, and this is why I quite like to use a milliner's needle, because it's quite long and thin, I find it helps me for making sure that I don't stitch through the templates. So you can start to see here, I would probably pull that slightly tighter, because then I find that the stitches kind of melt into the fabric a little bit. That makes it sound like I've overheated it, doesn't it? That they blend into the fabric. So I'm just going to keep working my way and whipping the stitch. It goes over each time and then feeding through. And I know some people prefer to stitch it towards them, so the principle's still the same. So you would go through the two edges but bring the needle towards you and over like that. So again, have a play and just see kind of what works for you. When I say it's about 1/16 of an inch, I'm not being too precise in how I do it. I'm not measuring it out. This is just roughly. And you can see that I am pulling it. So I'm now going to take the clip off, and I'm getting close enough to it that I don't want it to start catching on the clip, because then it gets a bit of a faff for trying to sort it. And you want to make sure that you're not sewing, as I catch the tail, you want to make sure that you're not sewing with the tail of your thread, because then that becomes a two-stranded thread. So lessen the tail as you go, but leave yourself with enough thread to be able to knot at the end, because you don't want to be running so short that you run out. So I'm going to go right up to the very, very edge here. You can see I'm going through here right on the very edge. Let me bring that back up. So I'm going through here, try and catch the tail by mistake, and then I'm going to go through in exactly the same spot with the second stitch. But before I pull the thread all the way through, you can see there's a loop of thread here. I'll get this back in focus. There's a loop of thread, and I'm going to pass that needle through that loop once, twice, and then I'm going to pull it, and that's created a knot here right on that edge. So you can open it up and you can see that it's joined these pieces together, and the stitches aren't showing on the front, and that's because we've used a thread that blends in. But because we're sewing these in threes, we now want to sew, so we stitch from the outside to the in, and now we're going to join this third one, and we're going to sew from the inside towards the outside. So right sides together. I'm going to put the clip here because I'm going to sew towards there, and then again, because I sew from left to right, I'm just going to turn it round so that I find it easier to see kind of what I'm sewing. And again, you can see this tail is in the way again here, so I'm just going to make sure that the thread's not getting caught up on it. I'm just going to pull that tail out of the way and hold it out of the way with my thumb. So I'm just going to take a stitch through at this very corner point again, and again I'm going to take another anchoring stitch in the same way that we took the anchoring stitch. I might just take a third one actually. There. So now that's anchored at this point. I'm now going to continue sewing, and you can see here how I'm having resistance getting my needle through, and that's because I'm not close enough to the edge of the fabric. I'm then going through the paper template. So I'm just going to make sure that I'm getting right at the very edges of the fabric. And I'm going to continue doing this whip stitch all the way up to this outer corner. And then once you have done this, you repeat it for the other three kites that are over here and ready to stitch, and then I'll show you how to join them. And this way it helps not to have a super long thread when stitching them together, because it's more likely to get tangled and knotted up and then it takes the fun out a bit, because you spend just as long trying to undo your knots as you do trying to do the stitching. So in the same way that we started 1/4 of an inch in from the edge, we're going to finish 1/4 of an inch in from the edge. So I'm going to sew all the way up, and I'm going to take a second stitch through right on that very edge, just for added strength. And then I'm going to take it back 1/4 of an inch so that the knot isn't on the weak point, and take the needle through once and do the second stitch, and before I pull it all the way through, I'm going to pass the needle through that loop once, twice, and pull it, and you should be able to feel, I don't know if it'll show up on camera, but I can definitely feel that there's a knot there, so you know that's knotted and that's okay. And then snip it, and that is your first 3. Let me get that extra bit of fluff off it, and that is your first 3 kites sewn together. So repeat it with these 3 and it will look something like this. So then the 2 halves need to be stitched together. So the way that I would do this is, again, I'm lining up these edges that I know I want them to meet at. So I'm going to put a clip here, because this is the edge that I'm going to sew towards. Now this is the middle bit, and you can see here that all these tails are going to get in the way, so I'm actually going to put a clip here, and this is where these small wonder clips can really help. So they're going to hold these out of the way, and I'm also going to put one here so it holds these out of the way. And again, I'll take these off as I sew towards them, and I'm going to start on here. So I've cut a new piece of thread, and I've put 3 knots at the end again, and I'm going to start 1/4 of an inch in from the edge. I'm going to lift this up so it's in camera. So I'm going to start 1/4 of an inch in and taking a stitch through the edge fibres of the shapes and not the paper templates. I'm going to do a second stitch just so it's really anchored in, and now I go back to the start, and I'm just going to take these small stitches through the very edge fibres of this. I think my camera's not playing ball today, it doesn't want to stay in focus, does it? So you can see I've just caught some of the basting thread there, but that's fine because that'll come out. And I'm just pulling it through. So actually, as I said that, the stitch is going to come out. So when you have, I would leave all the paper pieces in until they're secured on all edges, and by that I mean once you've attached the blocks to other blocks and it creates a sort of frame around it, then you can start to remove your paper pieces. But at the moment, if I took these paper pieces out, you'd lose that strength and that structure and the stability. So I'm just taking a stitch around about every 1/16 of an inch, and I'm pulling fairly tightly. And you'll see when we get to this middle bit, this is why having a thread that matches the colour of your fabric really helps. Right, so when I get close enough to this that it's going to start getting in the way, I'm going to take this clip off, get this back in focus, keep my fingers crossed that it'll stay in focus, and I'm going to keep stitching all the way up to this centre point. I tend to go slower when I get to this middle point because I really want to make sure I'm catching the right fabrics and not the paper piece, not the actual paper template. So I'm going right up to the edge here and taking it through. I'm then going to take this clip off, and I'm going to pull this tail so I can see this edge slightly more clearly. And I'm going to take the edge of this fibre, and I'm actually going to join it with the edge of the fibre in that direction. So I'm stitching almost with the fabric that's diagonal from where I am at. And I'm just going to take a second stitch here. And now I'm going to repeat it again, but diagonally this way. So I'm going to take a stitch from this fabric to the fabric diagonally from it. Just hold that tail out the way so it doesn't catch and pull it. And now I'm still going to go back in and continue doing the whip stitch here. So I'm going through this edge, and now I'm going through the two fibres opposite one another, and exactly the same way we've done with the other ones. So ordinarily with the whip stitch you kind of go through the fibres on the fabrics that are opposite each other. When it got to this middle point, I went on the diagonal then, and then I go back to doing it as it was before. Sewing all the way up to the other clip. And then we'll do the same thing that I said before, where we don't tie the knot on the very, very edge. I tend to come back 1/4 of an inch. Just because once the shape's opened out, sometimes I think the very edges can sort of be not weak points, but more prone to thread knots slipping through. That's, I don't know, maybe that's just my personal experience. So don't be afraid to manipulate the shape as well, because it is only paper and you can iron it all out afterwards. So, you know, find the way that works for you. So I'm going right up to the very edge. You can see how hard I pull my thread actually, can't you? That's why I tend not to get on so well with cotton thread for this, just because I do pull it really tight. So I've taken one stitch, I'm going to take a second stitch. And I'm now going to take it back 1/4 of an inch. Take a stitch and a second stitch. And then pass my needle through the loop once, twice. Pull it, make sure you can feel the knot there. Snip the thread, and then let me get this back in focus. So I'm going to open up and back first, so you can see, because the tails on this, we made sure that they were all going in the same direction. And this is when you can start to see that it really helps, because they can sort of nest on top of each other. And then you can see on the front of it, that is your shape all joined. And if you hold it up to the light, there isn't any gaps coming through here. And if I hold it up really close, you can see that there are stitches showing. But because it's in a thread that matches, if you think when that's in a whole quilt, no one's going to notice that there's a stitch on show there. You know it's super strong because you've put some extra stitches in it, and you can start to join them together and it'll all blend in. So that is how I sew the kites together.